New guy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks so much, Mr. Tillerson, for your presence here today. I'd like to return to an issue which has received quite a bit of discussion and dialogue here today, and it's the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia in the wake of their annexation of Crimea, their armed intervention in eastern Ukraine. And you've indicated to me privately and again here publicly that you had a couple of concerns, aside from the fiduciary concerns, that is, your duty to ensure you maximize shareholder value as CEO of ExxonMobil. You had concerns with respect to the ill formation of these sanctions, the fact that there was a disparity between the U.S. and EU's sanctions regime, and therefore you didn't believe that sanctions regime would work. Is that correct?
Well, I think I expressed the view that it was likely to be ineffective.
Okay. I'm going to give you an opportunity to explain that in greater detail. In the wake of our private meeting, we contacted the Congressional Research Service, and they indicated, and I'll submit this report for the record here, but that in practice, and I'm quoting, it appears that U.S. and EU sectoral sanctions are broadly similar. They did say it appears, but kindly explain the distinction between those two sanctions regimes that made you conclude they'd be ineffective.
And I was speaking in terms of the sector that I was involved in at the time, oil and natural gas development. The EU sanctions contained a grandfathering provision, which allowed activity that was already underway in the targeted sanction areas to continue. In the U.S. sanctions, there was no grandfathering. And in this dialogue that was going on during the development of the sanctions, that was part of the input to the process, both to the Treasury Secretary. I spoke to Secretary Lew myself to point out that there was this gap and that it could lead to problems for U.S. interest from two perspectives. One was the operational effect that I just described a moment ago in response to the chairman's question, that an immediate effect would put operations that were ongoing at risk. So there was that issue. But the second was that to the extent European activities in the same sanctioned areas could continue because they were grandfathered, would put U.S. interest in this particular part of the sector at a disadvantage because U.S. could not continue to demonstrate its capabilities. Our European partners could, and it put at risk the possibility that agreements that had been entered into might be terminated.
So it's the grandfathering component. We'll look more into that. Mr. Chairman, submit this for the record, please.
Without objection.
Let me pose a hypothetical, perhaps a bit. It gets to the heart of the matter of trying to separate one's responsibilities, one's incentives as the CEO of a major multinational corporation, though U.S.-based, from perhaps your coming role as the chief diplomat of the United States. Assume that something that's not particularly lacking in plausibility, that Russia were to send troops and weapons into the Kiev area, into Ukraine. Assume further that a well-formed sanctions regime is presented to you as Secretary of State. Finally, assume that sanctions regime would disadvantage the bottom line of American-based multinationals. Would you still propose, would you still advocate that the United States of America advance its national interests by adopting this sanctions regime?
Senator, I think as I've indicated now several times, the use of sanctions is an important and can be powerful tool as long as they are constructed to be effective. In an instance like the example you give, there will be, I'm sure, discussion at the National Security Council of all of the options, but the sanctions will be certainly an important option to have on the table for consideration. And if that is the option selected, I will vigorously support those.
Very, very good. With respect to the U.S. and EU sanctions, it's already been presented to you that there's a possibility of removing those. You indicated that for now you believe the status quo should reign, in part because, I think understandably, I'm sympathetic to this, you indicated you lack sufficient information. You haven't been read in with respect to classified material, correct?
That is correct.
Your nomination was announced on December 13th. You've never served in government before. It's understandable you wouldn't have a security clearance until now, until last evening. You had a security clearance. Would you be willing to receive a classified security brief from our intelligence community this evening, assuming we may go into tomorrow with respect to this hearing, focused intently on Russia?
If all of the papers in place and I have been cleared, I understand it's on file. I just haven't received any notice yet, but I look forward to having access to the additional information.
So you would be willing?
Yes.
All right. Further, as the nation's chief diplomat, it's really important, as we've seen with this previous administration, that the chief diplomat of the United States speak with a voice that is perceived to be the voice of the President of the United States. There cannot be space between what you are saying, the policies you are putting forward, and those that are embraced by our now President-elect. He has a history of utilizing, to very well-known effect, social media, Twitter in particular. And some of the President-elect's tweets appear to be quickly drafted, not vetted by staff or coordinated with the transition team's senior officials. So this gives pause to me. This gives some concern that in coming months and coming years, you might not be empowered to actually serve as the chief diplomat. You would lack credibility. So how do you finesse this? How would you ensure that the legs are not cut out from underneath you as the nation's chief diplomat, and perhaps you have some ideas on this?
Well, if confirmed, and I am able to serve this President-elect, I don't think I'm going to be telling the boss how he ought to communicate with the American people. That's going to be his choice. But in carrying out and executing and implementing the foreign policy, including traveling abroad, and I understand your point. I'm overseas, and that it would be my expectation that any way the President might choose to communicate through whatever method would be supportive of that policy we both agreed on.
So do you have in mind any contingency plans to
Yes, I have his cell
address?
phone. I have his cell phone number.
Okay.
And he's promised me he'll answer.
And he does.
We'll hope for the best there, unless you have anything else to add. In your prepared statement, you write that Russia must know that we will be accountable to our commitments and those of our allies. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty states that an armed attack against one or more member states in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. Mr. Tillerson, if Putin were to instigate a Crimea-style invasion of a NATO member, let's say Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania, do you believe the U.S. should and would honor its treaty obligation, join our allies in defending our fellow NATO member against external invasion?
The Article 5 commitment is inviolable, and the U.S. is going to stand behind that commitment.
So yes.
If that is the consensus of NATO members that that's the appropriate use of Article 5, then yes.
Okay. I yield back.